just to just to limit background noise and distraction. So again, thank you to Nature Alberta. Glad everybody's participating tonight. A wonderful audience. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy to introduce our speakers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ken. Yeah, we're super excited to be hosting Mark and John tonight to talk about whooping crane ecology and changes in their population and what it's like being out in the field. Um, John is a wildlife biologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Mark is a research ecologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada as well. And yeah, they've been studying whooping cranes for quite a long time, and uh, it's come they've come quite a far way. Since the 1940s, there were under 20 individuals, and so really excited to see what what has transpired since then and what the population looks like today. And so yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Mark and John, and thank you so much for doing this webinar, and it was lovely getting to talk to you before this webinar about birds and my history with birds. And so I'm excited to hear more about your love of being out in the field. So yeah, go for it.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Nancy and Ken. It's a real pleasure to be here with you tonight. And I wanted to thank, on behalf of John and myself and our team at Canadian Wildlife Service in Saskatoon, I wanted to thank both Nature Alberta and the Wood Buffalo Research Institute for extending the invitation to us. We feel very fortunate to be able to work on whooping cranes and with whooping cranes and to support the recovery of what is really an iconic species for conservation in Canada. We like to say that we stand on the shoulders of giants. We've worked ourselves for the better part of 15 years, going on 15 years now. But we're only able to do that because of those who came before us. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to do the work we do and to present to you all tonight. So again, very big thank you for the invitation. Before we kick this off, we actually wanted to start by recognizing that everything we do is highly collaborative. So we couldn't do this work without other people who also have a dedication to conserving species at risk and to working on this particular endangered species. And so this slide just shows some of our partners and the main collaborators who stand with us in conducting this work, including several very important partners in Alberta. And I'll just call out the Wilder Institute, Calgary Zoo, and the University of Alberta, who are among our closest collaborators on research that we're conducting into use of habitat and space use and habitat use and various ecological research projects and monitoring projects that we have on the go currently. We've carved up this presentation into a number of different sections, and each of us is going to tackle several of these sections. John's going to start right away by giving us some background information on whooping cranes. Then I'm going to speak about the mandate of our organization, the Canadian Wildlife Service, and some of the methods we use in the field. And once we have the data, how we analyze the data to try to make inferences about whooping cranes. And that section there will have a focus on satellite tracking, which is a method that we use in almost everything we do currently. And then finally, we'd like to end the presentation with a few examples of how we monitor whooping cranes and the different types of science projects that we carry out to inform the recovery of this species. So I'll speak about migration and John will speak about monitoring on the breeding grounds. So I think with that, I'm going to hand this over to John, who will give us some background information on the species.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark, and thank you very much, Nancy and Ken, and everyone who's involved with organizing this presentation. We're always keen to share results, and so we really appreciate this invitation. I kind of wanted to jump in it pretty fast. We have kind of a short time. I know there's an important hockey game happening up in about an hour or so, so I don't want to hold people too much into that. We've done our best to kind of build this presentation using a lot of photos and videos and things like that. Hopefully things to keep people engaged or interested as we go. Being scientists, there's still the odd graph or some results like that might creep in there, but we'll do our best to kind of keep this more high level and use photos and things like that to kind of tell the story. But as Mark mentioned, we're going to start with a little bit of background on the species and the habitats they use, things like that. We know there's a lot of keen naturalists and a lot of knowledgeable folks probably on this call, but we don't want to make the assumption that everyone in attendance has the same familiarity with the species. So we're just going to have some very basic information about the birds. So to start, I guess, so whooping cranes are among 15 crane species worldwide. 2 species occur in North America, of course, being whooping cranes and sandhill cranes. Whooping cranes being the rarest of all crane species, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. They're the tallest bird in North America, almost 5 feet tall in height. They can have a wingspan of up to 8 feet. The males and females are similar in appearance, although the males tend to be a bit larger. In appearance, of course, as you can see in those photos, they're white overall with those black wingtips that are visible in flight. The young start with this reddish or rust coloration when they're born, and those white feathers start to come in as they develop over that first year and into their first summer. We could switch to the next slide, please, Mark. Okay, in terms of habitat, so whooping cranes are very much habitat specialists, meaning that they rely on wetlands throughout all life stages or all stages of their life. They really rely on these shallow wetlands of different types for meeting all their needs. And so they use things like marshes and shallow lakes, of course, but also rivers and sandbars, mud and salt flats, coastal areas, and salt marshes, estuaries. So quite a variety of wetland types, but very dependent on these different wetlands throughout their migration corridor and then also in their summer and winter locations. So whooping cranes will use upland areas, of course, and this is primarily for feeding. They'll use prairie habitats, but most notably, they really use agricultural areas for feeding, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about some of their migration habitats. So if you want to smooth, thanks. So while whooping cranes are specialists in their habitats, they're very much generalists in what they eat. They'll eat both animals and plant foods. Given that they're aquatic species, most of their food sources are aquatic food sources as well. So eat a variety of insects, snails, frogs, fish, many stations throughout their range. In coastal areas, they use crabs and clams, things like that. Upland areas, they'll eat things like berries and fruits and other natural foods. And as we mentioned already, on migration, they really rely on these agricultural foods. Things like raised grains and corn become a very important food source for the kind of fuel those long distance migrations. So just to highlight a few behavioral items for whooping cranes. So you might be aware they're monogamous, so they thought to mate for life, although there's probably some exceptions to these rules. But in general, they mate for life. They are territorial. They'll establish territories and defend those territories, especially during the breeding grounds, but they'll also do establish territories and then wintering grounds as well, where they'll defend food resources or space for their young. Cranes are long-lived. They can live well into their 20s in the wild, sometimes longer than that. Their breeding tends to be delayed. Often they won't start breeding till they're 4 or 5 years old. And both mates, both male and female, will have responsibilities for raising those young and building nests and incubating those eggs. So they really work together to raise that next generation. So in terms of their conservation status, I think most of us are aware they're endangered species. So classified endangered under Canada's Species at Risk Act, similarly classified under the United States Endangered Species Act. So when we consider status in Canada, we're really only focusing on this one population that's called the Aransas-Wood Buffalo Population. So this is the only naturally occurring and the only wild population of whooping cranes, and the only population that occurs in Canada. So the federal endangered status under Canada's Species at Risk Act is based on an assessment done by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And so that acronym is CSIRIC. And so under that assessment, that endangered status comes from the fact that whooping cranes have a very small population size and they have a really limited distribution. They breed in one location and they winter at a single location. So historically, whooping cranes were pretty widespread across North America, especially eastern of the continental divide. They occupy a variety of habitats from subarctic and boreal areas, prairie and coastal areas, and their winter range extended well into Mexico and central Mexico. And so we'll discuss a bit more, but now today, whooping cranes are breeding in boreal areas, but historically, they're much more common probably throughout the US Midwest and Prairie Canada, and are probably more abundant in these areas. And so although they are widespread, we don't think their population was necessarily very large. Estimates are somewhere around 10,000 individuals at their peak during that post-glacial period. So in terms of population declines and kind of how we got to where we are today, the story is similar for so many species at risk. Since the arrival of Europeans and settlement throughout North America, we saw pretty drastic declines through hunting and habitat losses. Whooping cranes were hunted for food. Their feathers and eggs were collection items. Of course, their habitat was lost as wetlands were drained for agricultural purposes. So a very similar story for so many grassland and other species throughout our continent. And so declines in this period were so drastic that by about 1870, we were down to about 1,300 individuals. And so these declines they didn't go unnoticed. Around the turn of the 19th century, we started to see movements to protect these natural resources. So things like the establishment of wildlife and conservation societies, things like the Audubon Society. We got to see legal and regulatory protections starting to come into place, things like the Migratory Bird Act that started to protect migratory birds from hunting and trafficking and commercialization. And we also saw establishment of protected areas, and that being a very important tool for conservation. And so in those early days, whooping cranes' winter habitat was protected in Texas. That happened in the 1930s. At that time, we didn't know where they bred, that remaining population. And so that was a kind of a key gap in knowledge in terms of conservation. So despite those kind of early efforts of conservation, population continued to decline for whooping cranes. So by about 1940, as Nancy mentioned in the intro, that population was reduced to about 22 individuals in two populations. So a few individuals in a small non-migratory population in Louisiana, and these 16 individuals in the Aransas-Wood Buffalo population. And so that Louisiana population would become extinct by about 1950. And again, at the time, we didn't know where the breeding grounds for these remaining 16 individuals were. So the stories really started to turn around the 1950s and 60s, and it was really reliant on this idea of public education and outreach. The continued habitat protections were still important, but it was really that outreach and education that really was key for whooping cranes. And so for Canada, the discovery of the breeding grounds in 1954, of course, a really important milestone. The search for the breeding grounds was led by a man named Robert Porter Allen. I'm not going to go into his story tonight, but it's kind of a longer story, but it's actually a really, really interesting story, and it can encourage folks who are interested in the history of these early days of conservation to look into his story, because it's a really good read, and there's some really good books and resources about this. But with that being said, now we knew the location of the breeding grounds, and it allowed those key monitoring and conservation measures, like the annual surveys, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and also the idea of conservation breeding programs to establish other populations of whooping cranes. And so those programs, of course, were reliant on eggs that were collected from Wood Buffalo National Park over a 30-year period. So a really important step in those early days. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah, so we'll just touch really briefly about those conservation breeding programs and the reintroduction programs. So the formal captive breeding programs began at a research center in Maryland called the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. This is a U.S. federal government center that's no longer in operation, but a number of other institutions have sort of since joined in breeding programs. We'll highlight on two other breeding efforts, partly because they're the larger operations, but mainly because they're the key partners in whooping crane recovery beyond the conservation breeding aspect. So the first being the International Crane Foundation. This is in Wisconsin. Their program began in 1989. They're the largest holder of whooping cranes for conservation breeding. They have about 44, 45 birds in that program. But as Mark also highlighted to the Wilder Institute Calgary Zoo, and a really important partner in this work. So Wilder Institute represents Canada's only conservation breeding center for whooping cranes. Wilder is really regarded in terms of their conservation research and evidence-based approaches to animal care and husbandry, and the work they do has really been important in advancing the methodology and best practices in these areas, which is really improving the success of conservation breeding across North America. So Alberta should be very proud of that accomplishment and the work that those folks do. We'll just touch briefly on the reintroductions. So obviously the cranes that are held under human care serve as an important safety net for insurance or losses in the wild population. But more importantly, they act as a source of individuals that can be released into these wild populations in efforts to establish whooping crane populations in other parts of the historic range. So a number of reintroduction attempts have occurred, all in the United States. I won't get into detail of all of them, but I'll just mention that there's two active reintroductions that are having some success. You might be familiar with the story of Operation Migration. So this is kind of the origin story for the eastern migratory population of whooping cranes. And so these are where young birds were taught their safe migration and wintering locations by following an ultralight aircraft that was piloted by a human wearing a whooping crane costume. So the ultralights are no longer used in this program, but it was an important first step in establishing that population. Switch to the next slide, please. Okay, so slide here just shows the current distribution of all wild whooping cranes in all populations. So it includes the two populations of reintroduced birds, so that eastern migratory population, and again, the second population was the establishment of another population in Louisiana. But now we're going to kind of narrow our focus really into this Aransas-Wood Buffalo population. And again, just as a reminder, this is the original wild population and their source of all cranes alive today. And of course, the only population that comes into Canada, and it's the focus of our recovery efforts. So just to roll up some of the things we've just discussed in the last few minutes in one slide, a bit of a timeline of those birds. So we saw that population low back in 1941, 42, discovery of the breeding grounds in the mid-50s. Once we had that in place, aerial surveys began, and then the egg collection efforts to support those conservation breeding and release programs. These abundance estimates that are shown in this graph are based on winter surveys that are conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you can see that continued increase in the population over time. So it's been a really positive story for whooping cranes so far, and we're really, privileged to be just a small part of this. And so despite these, successes, we want to sort of have a little bit of, we don't want to celebrate too early, right? Because whooping cranes still potentially have things that might threaten their populations. So switch. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so we're still many years from downlisting from endangered status. The population is still quite small. Even minor losses for this population can reverse the trend from positive to negative. So those losses could be from direct mortalities or due to reduced reproduction or survival. So we're not going to go deep into all the different things potentially threatening whooping cranes today, but just highlighting a few right now. So illegal harvest through either accidental or intentional poaching is still occurring. There's the screenshot that's shown on the screen is of an occurrence of 5 whooping cranes that were shot in Oklahoma. Development continues to be a story for whooping cranes, affecting them throughout their range. This development can be through agriculture or industry or urban development. And this can affect them by direct habitat loss or collisions with infrastructure or things like environmental contamination. Another aspect is a bit more of an emerging issue is that of disease. 2025 was the first occurrence of mortality for avian influenza for whooping cranes. So kind of certainly a very concerning story for that. 2 occurrences of mortalities in our Aransas-Wood Buffalo population occurred in Saskatchewan last year. There's also another in the eastern migratory population in that same year. And then potentially the biggest threat to whooping cranes is climate change. There's still much we need to know, much to learn about this, but it's thought to be among the top threats for whooping cranes. So climate change aspects could impact whooping cranes in so many ways, from their habitat or for the food availability. So it's something we're certainly looking to find more information about. So with that, I think I'm going to pass over to Mark to get into a little bit of the mandates and methods about the work that we do.
That's great. Thank you very much, John. With that background information, we'd now like to discuss the organization that we work for and what our mandate is and what some of the methods that we use are to carry out our mandate. So both John and I work for the Canadian Wildlife Service, which is a branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. The mandate with respect to species at risk of CWS is to provide the scientific foundation and regulatory framework required under SARA to prevent the extinction of wildlife and to secure the necessary conditions for their recovery. And so what that means in terms of our own annual cycle and the types of activities that we are asked to conduct, we carry out 3 main kinds of activities. So on the one hand, we carry out scientific assessment and monitoring. And the outputs of these activities, or the outcomes, are that we assess the population size. So we come up with estimates for how big the population is. We determine where the species is and what the trends are, both in terms of population size and distribution. And the main tools that we use for those kinds of activities are we conduct surveys, and we conduct statistical analyses of the data from those surveys. And increasingly, we use satellite tracking, which we'll spend some time talking about tonight. So that's kind of the first batch of activities. The next is that we carry out threat assessments and try to provide information to help mitigate or reduce threats to species at risk. And so the outcomes here are that we would identify activities that are likely to result in direct harm to the species or to the destruction of its critical habitat. And the main tools that we use there are, again, surveys, satellite tracking, and what we call focus studies, which are short-term research or monitoring efforts designed to provide information about threats or risks faced by whooping cranes. And finally, we conduct other activities which are known as applied science and implementation of recovery actions. And these really integrate information from different sources and result in recommendations for appropriate recovery actions. So what should be done to recover the species? And then we also use these methods to monitor the effectiveness of those activities. And again, you'll see we use satellite tracking and focus studies. In the case of whooping cranes, we carry out nest monitoring and wetland sampling to try to shed some light on these questions. And all of this information is used to create recovery planning documents. And so these are official documents posted to the Species at Risk registry, such as recovery strategies and action plans. So these are important recovery planning documents that essentially define what we mean by recovery for a given species. They identify critical habitat for that species and recommend specific recovery actions for the species. We also, of course, support our partners for their work on species recovery and land management and threat mitigation. So you can see here, we just wanted to highlight that many of these activities depend on satellite tracking. And so we'll spend a few minutes now talking about what that means and how we conduct that work. So this is work that we carry out with partners to try to learn more about the behavior and the movement and the habitat use throughout the annual cycle of endangered whooping cranes. We also use the data from satellite tracking to conduct research on risk from industrial development, and then we disseminate the findings of this research to help inform conservation and management of the species. As I mentioned, this work is collaborative, so we carry it out with our partners, and those partners include Parks Canada, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and the United States Geological Survey, and collectively those four agencies are working together under the Whooping Crane Tracking Partnership. We have been capturing cranes since whooping cranes since 2009. The juvenile birds are captured in the summer on the breeding grounds, and the adult birds and subadult birds are captured in Texas on the wintering grounds. We've marked to date 190 whooping cranes and collected over 13 million GPS locations of places that those cranes have gone. And of course, this results in a very rich data set on space use and habitat use and movement by these cranes that helps inform many questions that are designed to help result in the recovery of the species. So these are some pictures, just some examples of what our work in the field looks like. So you can see that we have a great field team of passionate biologists and crane handlers and wildlife veterinarians that work together to capture the cranes and attach these leg bands. So you can see the red arrow is indicating a colored leg band that uniquely identifies that crane. So that crane is known as white, green, yellow. And then anywhere white, green, yellow is seen throughout the range of the species, we can identify when that bird was captured, where it was captured, how old it is in many cases, and more information, just as you would for any banded bird that you might encounter in the course of your birding or your field work. So you can see that's on the bird's right leg, and then on the left leg, just above that colored band, is a small solar-powered satellite transmitter that connects to the GPS constellation of satellites and collects GPS locations for that particular bird on a duty cycle that can be as frequent as one location every minute, but typically we collect a location every 15 to 30 minutes. And that results in data that look like this. If you take a snapshot of the data, so this is the locations of the active transmitters today. Earlier today, we downloaded this map. You can see there's still at least one bird in Texas, a few birds in the Dakotas. Most of the cranes we're tracking are currently in Saskatchewan on their way to you folks in Alberta. So these birds are obviously in spring migration and on their way from the Gulf Coast of Texas up to Wood Buffalo National Park and adjacent areas of the Northwest Territories. So we often give a presentation like this to kids, and one question we get asked is, how do you capture a whooping crane? And so the answer to that is very carefully. It takes months of planning. Our work involves a capture team incorporating wildlife biologists from CWS and Parks Canada, and a crane handler and a wildlife veterinarian from the Wilder Institute Calgary Zoo. And those people are essential members of our field team. They're the people who are responsible for capturing and handling the birds. That's Dr. Sandy Black on the left from the Calgary Zoo, and she's been working with whooping cranes for decades, longer than both John and I, and she's the person who's responsible for conducting a health check. Once we have a bird in hand, Dr. Black carries out a health check to make sure that the bird is healthy and safe to be handled and banded. And so she does that before the banding is done and the transmitter is deployed. And I'll just say that the helicopter pilot that we work with, these pilots are also essential members of our team. We couldn't capture the birds without them. And I'll show you in a minute here a video of how the capture is actually done. We do use helicopters. It's really the only way that we can capture the birds in the remote Wood Buffalo National Park. The habitat requires us to use helicopters. We basically land, and a field team is deployed from the helicopter, and then that team has 12 minutes to capture the bird. And if the bird's not in hand by 12 minutes, we give up on that attempt. Typically, we've captured the bird within 6 minutes. And I'll just give you an example of what this looks like. In this next video, you can see the capture team has been dropped off on the ground and has pursued the juvenile crane and has now circled the crane. You can see the crane here in the middle of the wetland. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the crane is at the bottom of the screen in the middle of the wetland. And the capture team is approaching the crane and will hand capture that bird and then take it to the side of the wetland where it will be banded. The whole check will be carried out and the bird will be banded. And I'll just let this play out for a minute. You can see the crane handler now approaching the crane and very gently, carefully grabbing the bird. And then the team comes in and the bird is banded. That's how the capture event goes. And then after banding, this is a short video of what happens after the bird has been banded. So you can see this bird is being carried by the crane handler from the banding location, and she will release the bird into the wetland. This bird has its color bands on the left leg and the GPS transmitter on its right leg. As I mentioned earlier, these are juvenile birds that we capture at Wood Buffalo National Park and adjacent areas of the Northwest Territories. So they're brown birds. Typically, these birds will reunite with their parents within a few certainly within a few hours of our releasing them back to their parents. So, having talked a little bit about the satellite tracking, we wanted to now discuss what these data help us better understand about the birds. And so we're going to do that by illustrating how the birds migrate in Western Canada on the way from Texas up through to Wood Buffalo National Park in the case of spring migration, which we are in the midst of right now. And so it's important to point out that whooping cranes migrate through both Saskatchewan and Alberta. In spring, they do so in April and May on the way back up to the breeding grounds at Wood Buffalo. And in the fall, they migrate from August through November on the way back to the Texas Gulf Coast. In these prairie provinces, they make extensive use of prairie, parkland, and boreal regions in both spring and fall migration. But fall staging in prairie and parkland Saskatchewan is particularly important. The reason for that is that whooping cranes spend up to 8 weeks in Saskatchewan staging and fueling for the 3,800 kilometer migration from Wood Buffalo to the Gulf Coast of Texas. So this is an example of a project that depended on data from the tracking project. And you can see in the map on the right, those green dots represent roosting locations. So these are places that whooping cranes roosted overnight. And between 2019 or 2009 rather, and 2025. So each dot represents a roosting location by an individual crane. And then we've used these data to analyze and identify what we refer to as migratory hotspots, or complexes that are used, complexes of stopover locations that are used by whooping cranes in these areas. And so if you look at just the top 10% of those green dots that I showed you in the previous plot, the top 10% of the roost locations within each province, patterns appear. And you can see in Saskatchewan, in central Saskatchewan, for example, you can see areas that are used much more than others. And so those areas that are highlighted in red have the highest use, and areas highlighted in green have the lowest use, but these are all within the top 10% of all locations. And so that's in central Saskatchewan. In northern Alberta, where the birds move into after they leave Saskatchewan, we've identified a hotspot or a stopover complex in the area around Fort McMurray in the oil sands region. So that's identified on the map as the AOSR. And then a third area in the Peace Athabasca Delta in the southern sector of Wood Buffalo National Park. So these, of course, represent very different habitats, very different types of land use and threats. As you can see in the photos on the left and the right, they're completely different types of habitats, and so require different approaches to conservation planning. I'll talk first about Saskatchewan. So in the fall, in particular, in central Saskatchewan, cranes are using agricultural landscapes. And they do so because they benefit from access to high quality food in terms of fallen grain after the harvest, and also natural food items in wetlands. But they also benefit from from a high density of semi-permanent wetlands and shallow lakes. So it's a combination of food and habitat that is available to the birds, and they take advantage of that and use that by spending long amounts of time, like large amounts of time in Saskatchewan in the fall. So those are the benefits to cranes of these areas. Some of the risks include habitat loss and modification. So John talked about the conversion of the prairies after European colonization to agriculture, and indeed that occurred and continues to occur. And so the wetlands that remain and the habitat that remains is at risk. And cranes themselves are at risk because they may be exposed to agrochemicals and other contaminants in the wetlands when they stop over. We recently conducted a study that was based on survey data collected since the 1970s. Surveys both conducted by biologists and by citizen scientists. And so it's a very rich data set and a long-term data set. And we determined that since the 1970s, the period of occupancy by whooping cranes in the fall has lengthened by almost a month. So in the 70s, cranes would spend about a month in Saskatchewan. In the early 2020s, that had been extended to almost 2 months. And if that trend continues by 2035, we predict that cranes will be spending up to close to 70 days in central Saskatchewan in the fall. And that's illustrated in this plot, which in the top panel shows really no relationship in the spring between the date of arrival and year. But in the fall, you can see that red arrow highlights the gap between the earliest arrival in the fall and the latest arrival in the fall. So the earliest arrivals are identified with the open circles and the latest arrivals with the solid circles. And you can see that that top line represents cranes staying longer. And the bottom line represents cranes arriving earlier. And so what's happening is that longer period of occupants in Saskatchewan is due to an earlier arrival in the fall and a later departure in the fall. And we know, because we tested for it statistically, that the later departure is associated with warmer temperatures. So cranes are able to spend longer in Saskatchewan in the fall because the wetlands remain open for longer. So freezing is delayed and the wetlands are available to them through late October or early November, which means that they can take advantage of the rich food sources available to them and the habitat for a longer period in the fall. And so what we realize is that we really need to consider this longer period of occupancy in Saskatchewan in our conservation planning and in identification of critical habitat. If cranes are going to be spending more time here, then that needs to be considered in those activities. And that's something that we wouldn't have known without the scientific work that we do, which involves both satellite tracking and surveys conducted by biologists and by citizens. So we'd like to turn next to the other two areas that are used by whooping cranes in Western Canada during migration. So these are the Alberta oil sands region around Fort McMurray and the Peace Athabasca Delta in southern Wood Buffalo National Parks. The first thing I would like to point out is that in contrast to Saskatchewan in the fall, of course, when these cranes move into the northern part of Alberta, they're migrating through landscapes dominated by boreal forests and forests associated wetlands. So they're complex mixes of natural habitat and habitat that's impacted by industrial footprint. It's the working forest that involves forestry and mining and oil sands development. And when we started tracking whooping cranes about 15 years ago, we started to realize, and I mean, this had been known for some time, but we started to realize when the data rolled in that almost all of the whooping cranes we tracked were migrating through the oil sands region, and most of them were migrating through the mineable area. More than half of the migrations, it turns out, include stopovers in the oil sands region. Those stopovers, in contrast to the ones in Saskatchewan, are quite short, so they last only a day or two. Most of those stopovers occur outside of industrial areas. So they tend to stop over in natural areas, especially those which incorporate fen and marsh habitats. But some of the stopovers do stop on leases and other industrial sites, including, in some cases, on ponds containing process-affected water. associated with oil sands mining. We don't map this here, but we have identified that in northern Alberta, there are key stopover locations, and some of them include the pad, as we've talked about, the Peace Athabasca Delta, the Athabasca River, McClellan Lake, and the Gypsy, Gordon, and Birch Lakes areas. You can see on that map the migration corridor, which was partly identified as a result of satellite tracking, is identified with those red lines. So the migration corridor essentially takes whooping cranes directly over the mineable area of the Alberta oil sands region on their way to Wood Buffalo National Park. So we were, really quite concerned by that when we realized that whooping cranes were migrating through the oil sands region. And we wanted to learn more about their behavior in this area, and in particular to quantify their behavior during stopovers. And so to do that, we teamed up with Dr. Andy Crosby and Dr. Aaron Bain at the University of Alberta. Dr. Crosby has undertaken efforts in cooperation with ourselves to model the selection of stopover habitat during migration and to assess the potential avoidance of oil sands infrastructure. And so this slide simply makes the point that we are using a number of different data sets, including data from the ABMI, including their annual human footprint and their backfilled vegetation layer. So we want to know what is the human footprint in areas used by whooping cranes, and do whooping cranes avoid it, or are they unable to avoid it, or do they perhaps even select for it? We know that on the prairies, whooping cranes are often selecting areas associated with anthropogenic use. And so it's a legitimate question to ask, what are they doing in these landscapes? And so we paired those data with data from our tracking project, including tracking data from over 150 cranes over a period of 15 years and over 700 individual migrations. The work that we did on this project involved delineating stopover sites. So you can see on the left, each black location represents a location that a crane was on the ground. And then we clustered these into stopover areas and analyzed what was inside those stopover areas in terms of different types of habitat and human footprint. And these models considered both the selection of these stopover sites, but also how cranes selected areas within the stopover site. So it was selection at two different scales. We learned that that each year, about 2/3 of cranes stop at least once in the oil sands region, and about 1/3 of them stop in the mineable area. Some cranes stop for multiple times within a season. And as I said previously, most stops or stopovers are typically in natural areas, but some occur at industrial sites. And you can see on this plot on the left, the map on the left shows the mineable area, with those colored areas indicating oil sands mines. The line kind of running up the middle is the middle of the migration corridor, and each black dot represents a stopover location. So you can see on the one hand that cranes seem to be avoiding human footprint. So they seem to be avoiding industrial areas that are impacted by industrial development. You can see within the mineable area, there are simply fewer black dots within that mineable area than there are on either side of it, suggesting that cranes are flying over. And on the one hand, this represents a loss of migratory habitat, but on the other hand, we know that some of these stopovers are in fact occurring in quite highly modified or heavily modified areas. And you can see that because there are some black dots on areas identified as oil sands mines. So the avoidance is quite interesting, and you can see that playing out in this little video, which I'll play for you now. So this video on the right is a It's an animation that we made using tracking data. It shows the flight path of one bird in fall of 2023, and it shows what it does when it encounters the Curl oil sands project. So this bird is coming in from Wood Buffalo. It looks like it's about to fly over Curl and avoids it, and then also avoids the Firebag project. So this bird has successfully avoided that mine, which is good. It didn't land. But you could ask the question, have these developments removed migratory habitat for these birds? We think that's a legitimate question to ask. And of course, at the same time as most of the birds avoid these landscapes, sometimes they do stop in industrial areas. And so our research has shown that they do try to avoid them, which is good because it means that these features aren't in fact attracting whooping cranes to them. They're not acting as what we might call ecological traps. But despite the tendency to avoid these human features, cranes do sometimes stop in them. And you can see that they've stopped in those areas within the red circles, which are identified by yellow dots. Those are the locations where cranes landed. We would consider these landscapes to be risky for these cranes. So some of the implications of this, at least the early implications of this work, first of all, cranes have not shifted their migration. They haven't started to fly around the oil sands region. They're flying right over it. Cranes experience areas of high risk due to high levels of disturbance along the migration corridor, especially in the oil sands region. And these models and maps can serve as baseline information for decision makers and for land managers in this region. I wanted to just pause briefly here and talk a little bit about some ongoing work. We know that as a result of this, we learned that cranes stop in areas where they may be exposed to higher levels of some contaminants, some environmental contaminants associated with oil sands mining. And we found, in fact, that the concentration of some of those contaminants are higher at stopover sites than at reference sites. And so this map simply shows that we wanted to test whether the birds were being exposed to higher level of contaminants in the Alberta oil sands compared to their breeding range in Wood Buffalo National Park. So on the left of this map, we show sites at Wood Buffalo, about 400 kilometers north of the oil sands region, which is shown on the right. And so to answer that question, we collected wetland samples from both regions, at nest sites in Wood Buffalo and at migratory stopover sites in the oil sands. And our goal was really to measure which contaminants and at what concentrations whooping cranes might encounter in each area. We don't have time tonight to go into the field methods in detail, but very briefly, we collected surface water grab samples and we deployed passive contaminant samplers, known as SPMDs and POSIS devices. And these samplers get put in the wetland, left there for 30 days. They contain a semi-permeable membrane that collects and integrates contaminants over a period of about a month. Then you go back and you pick up these devices and send them off to a lab for analysis to determine the concentrations of the chemicals of interest. At Wood Buffalo on the left, you can see that we sampled 30 natural undisturbed wetlands used by nesting. These are all natural wetlands without any sources of contaminants. And in the OSR, we sampled 25 migratory sites. 11 of them were natural, while the rest were classified as semi-industrial. Those are showing up as blue triangles, or industrial, which show up as red squares. And that classification depended on their proximity to mines and tailings ponds and other oil sands facilities. And so I'll show you the preliminary results from this work. This plot compares the concentrations of polycyclic aromatic compounds and naphthenic acids between nesting sites in Wood Buffalo and migratory sites in the Alberta oil sands region. And this particular plot comes from water grab samples, but we have a similar results from the passive samplers. And these are two classes of contaminants that are associated with bitumen extraction with known health effects for birds and other wildlife. Although I will point out that they are naturally occurring in the environment. And so they're not always associated, and they're not only associated with extraction of bitumen. The unshaded box plots in this plot represent wood buffalo. So the two on the left, the unshaded plot on the left and on the right represent wood buffalo. As I mentioned on the previous slide, these include only natural undisturbed sites, so they're green circles. The shaded plots represent the oil sands region, which include a mix of natural, semi-industrial, and industrial sites. So the green circles, the blue triangles, and the red squares. On the x-axis of this plot are the two contaminant classes, and the y-axis shows their concentrations on a log scale. So the log scale on that y-axis is important. It means that the upper end represents extremely high values relative to the lower end. And in fact, the three main takeaways from this are that the mean or the median concentrations of both types of contaminants were much higher in the OSR than at wood buffalo. Concentrations in the OSR were far more variable, so you can see that they span a much larger range along the y-axis, in fact, spanning several hundred times between sites. And third, and the last point here is simply that within the OSR, the highest concentrations occurred at industrial and semi-industrial sites. So we see these extremely high values of naphthenic acids, for example, many times higher than the lowest sites in the Alberta oil sands region, and of course higher than at wood buffalo. So overall, what this means is that when cranes stop at these sites affected by oil sands activities such as mines and tailings ponds or nearby infrastructure, they can encounter much higher contaminants levels than at natural wetlands, extremely high levels in some cases. And it's also important to note that we haven't sampled the most heavily disturbed stopover sites, such as the tailings ponds themselves, because those are quite difficult to access safely. And I'll just end this section by making the point that this work that we've conducted to sample the environment has been carried out along the entire migratory corridor for whooping cranes. So we've collected samples with buffalo, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan and Nebraska, where cranes may be exposed to higher levels of agricultural contaminants, and also in Texas, where cranes may be exposed to contaminants from many different sources, including industrial, oil and gas, and agriculture. And this is ongoing work, and I don't have time to run through this plot, but I'll just show you that on the bottom axis here, you can see the different regions that we've sampled. So with Buffalo, Alberta, Saskatchewan. You can see quite a lot of variation in the concentrations of the environmental contaminants that were measured at each of these sites. And one question we're left with is, what are the cumulative health effects of repeated exposure to elevated levels of contaminants across the annual range? We know cranes revisit the same sites. In many cases, they'll go back to them year after year and may be exposed to the same types of chemicals. And so we're very interested in learning more about the cumulative health effects on these birds of that type of repeated exposure. Okay, I think I'm going to pass this over to John now to take us home.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. So as Mark was describing some of the work we do during migration in parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta, we're kind of going to close, at least in terms of places, back on the breeding ground, so Wood Buffalo National Park and the surrounding area. And so just a quick overview of the activities that the cranes are doing while they're up there. Arrival for the birds tends to be in late May, anytime now actually, into late April into early May. Birds that are of breeding age will almost immediately start their nesting activities. That nesting period can range from late April into mid-June. Once they have eggs on the nest, that incubation can last about 30 days. Whooping cranes almost always will lay 2 eggs, but it's more common that only one chick will survive to hatch. So often both eggs will hatch, but typically the second chick will die due to either sibling aggression or predation or food shortages. After hatch, the chicks become mobile very quickly. They'll leave the nest within 1 to 2 days. But by about 80 days of age, they're capable of short flights, and a few weeks after that, they're capable of southern migration. So that migration can happen from early September all the way into November. So in terms of some of the activities that we conduct on the breeding grounds, kind of the core of our activities and the longest standing activity is those aerial surveys that we mentioned before. The objective of this work is to monitor the size and spatial extent, and then also the productivity of that breeding population. So these are key metrics that we use in our recovery plans and other documents to measure progress towards these recovery goals. And so these aerial surveys also give us information to understand responses to environmental changes over time. So for example, how breeding success might be impacted by things like drought or fire, which we've seen in recent years. So those surveys have been going for quite a while, 1966, and every year since. So the two graphs we're showing here are kind of the core data that come out of those surveys. The graph on the left shows that steady increase of nests over time. Obviously, you'd expect with increasing population, you're going to see an increase in number of nests. We're really proud of the number of nests we detected in 2025, 115 nests, which is the highest on record, and kind of an indication that that trend continues to increase after a couple of years of more flat trend. More promising, even so, is the number of chicks that were counted in 2025. 66 young were counted that year, so also another record high. So that graph on the right shows the annual productivity or the number of young per nest. But you can see that graph is very variable year to year, and that's in response to environmental conditions. So years like 2023 and 2024 were extremely dry, which equated to very poor productivity. Being water birds, they're really reliant on those kind of wetland conditions. So the last slide really showed kind of the abundance of those nests, but kind of the bigger story for the breeding grounds is this idea of breeding grounds expansion. So we often talk about these birds as whooping cranes that are in Wood Buffalo National Park, but that story doesn't quite hold true recently. They're expanding well outside the parks, and they have been for a number of years. And so the graphic that we'll start in a minute here just kind of shows that breeding ground expansion over time. And so if you can see, there's that brown polygon expanding over time. And so, in 1982, the first expansion outside of Wood National Park, and by 1998, that expansion occurring well outside of the park, and almost as far as the southern shore of Great Slave Lake. So, thanks. And so obviously, in terms of protections for the birds, there's a number of protections occurring within a national park. There's also critical habitat under the Species at Risk Act that are identified within the park. That's this dark polygon on the map to the right. So that polygon was defined in this recovery document that was near 19 years ago. But you can see this current breeding range well beyond that critical habitat. So there's a number of work to be done to update critical habitat to better understand the current use of breeding habitat for these birds, and also to identify critical habitat for birds that will be coming into the population as that population grows. So that's a key kind of priority for us to identify. And so we just wanted to touch base on a few examples of whooping crane habitat. So boreal areas of Canada are covered with wetlands, so we might think that there's plenty of spaces for whooping cranes to expand. But whooping crane habitat is actually quite unique. And so for cranes being a whiting bird, they require those shallow portions of wetlands. They prefer open habitats with fewer trees. That helps them protect predators. They also require quite a lot of space. So a given wetland might match that description of a shallow marsh, but if it's very small or isolated, there's chances that whooping crane won't use it. And so the examples we're going to use in the next few slides we're trying to convey this idea that whooping crane habitat is actually quite unique, and it's something I can really relate to. As the first time I was able to fly over Wood Buffalo National Park and surrounding areas, and you're just kind of blown away with the fact that this place is unique, or the areas that they're using is really unique. It's not like other places in the boreal. So the ideas, or the photos showing on the map here too. So we've seen examples of breeding habitat in the previous slide. These 4 photos on this slide show examples of other habitats that cranes will use. So it's not just that nesting marsh that they need other areas to access within their home range to meet all their requirements. So these can be these things like rivers and sandbars and salt flats, all different examples shown in this slide. And then the next little video that we'll show here is just kind of a compilation of aerial footage we've collected over the years to kind of demonstrate that idea that the habitat is really unique and expansive and really quite something. So as that breeding range expands into other areas, there's obviously that need to understand current habitat use and future habitat use. So those aerial surveys that we've talked about provide a good understanding of the current breeding within the known range, but we need other tools to find potentially new locations that are being used for breeding, and also tools to predict future use as the population grows. And so a key effort in this is to model breeding habitat. So this is another collaboration with our friends and colleagues at the University of Alberta. And so the objective of this work is to model and map habitat within the current breeding range, predict habitat, and forecast range expansion into new areas, and then use this information to inform conservation and planning and development. So the habitat data that went into this is the same information that went into some of the migratory habitat work that Mark described. Similarly, it relies on these telemetry data from birds that are marked with GPS transmitters, and also uses that data from those aerial surveys. And so the analysis basically uses these resource selection functions to model habitat use at multiple spatial scales, especially using these GPS locations of marked birds to identify the habitats that comprise the breeding home ranges, and to identify the species-specific habitats within those home ranges that are being used. And so when you apply these models spatially, it allows us to compare relative habitat suitability from one location to another. So the 2 images that are on the map on the screen right now are the same location, but the habitat suitability model on the right applying that suitability model to identify those hotspots of potential use for future years. And so this is really the first model of breeding habitat selection for whooping cranes for this population. So a really important advancement towards our knowledge. These models and maps provide a tool for predicting future habitat patterns. And we use these maps to identify places to search for breeding whooping cranes. And then ultimately, as I mentioned, is to use these to conserve and manage habitat. Okay, and now the last sort of specific project that we're going to touch on before we end tonight is this idea of breeding ground monitoring using remote nest monitoring. And so this project specifically is to get a better understanding of factors that affect nest success or failure. So these can be things like predation or weather factors, but it could also be things like parental behavior. And so for the Aransas-Wood Buffalo population, this project will help inform sort of demographic and population models, gives us rates of things like nest success and nest failure, but more generally, it just improves our knowledge about nesting ecology. But information from this also has value for conservation breeding programs. And so by studying the the parental behavior of these birds in this wild population, and see how it affects nest success, that can help guide management of those birds that are held under captive breeding populations, and also for those birds that are being released into reintroduced populations. So hence the partnerships with the Wilder Institute and our friend Diana Christie with Wilder. And so this work involves deploying remote monitoring equipment at nest sites. It's cameras that have time-lapse capabilities and videos. We also use recording devices, audio recording devices, and water level loggers. And so all these give information about environment like predation and weather, but might be impacting nest success, but also that idea of parental behavior and how that might affect nest success. And so we've got a couple of videos to close here with examples of this. And so the video we'll look at now shows a breeding pair of whooping cranes doing a whooping unison call. You're able to turn the volume on that, Mark? No, maybe I won't for that. But basically, the unison call is something that's thought to strengthen the pair, but strengthen that pair bond between those mated pair. And it also helps defend that territory from rival cranes. And so we might ask questions along these lines about, do these birds that demonstrate this kind of behavior, are they more successful than birds that do this kind of mated behavioral aspects? And so, are they more successful because they have a better bear pond? Or do wild birds in general do this more often than birds that are held under care? And does that influence how their success in their nesting? And the next example that we'll look to in the next slide is defense. So a question we might ask on this aspect is, do wild birds defend their nests more strongly than they do in reintroduced populations that are not doing as well? And so the video that we're watching now is an example of a predation event, but despite the predation by this black bear, it's quite a valiant effort by this whooping crane pair. They stayed through the entire event to try and defend their eggs. So it's hard to challenge a black bear like that. So some of the results we see from this work is ongoing, but preliminary results from this is showing that of nearly 50 nests we've monitored so far, success is quite high. So about 67% of the nests have hatched at least one egg. 13 nests, or about 27%, have shown some sort of abandonment. So abandonment tends to be in the late stages of incubation, where it's often suspected that eggs were infertile. But we've had 3 examples, at least during those years, of eggs being lost to predation. So we saw the example of the black bear, but we've seen also examples with raven, and then on the slide there is showing the example of a wolverine taking the eggs from the whooping crane. But again, you can see that adult whooping crane doing its best to try and protect its eggs. So we'll have additional data to inform this project from 2025 in the near future, and we'll be in the field again in coming weeks to deploy these cameras and those other monitoring equipment in coming weeks. So just to summarize this project, so far it seems that success is much more related to these intrinsic factors, so things like parental ability, or egg infertility, relative to things like that are more external, like predation, despite those few examples, and very few um, instances of failure due to weather. So this is ongoing research, and that could help inform management of cranes that are under human care, and also for those reintroduced populations. And then I think our last slide we have is, those last few examples provide examples of, data that has value to their understanding management of whooping cranes. But in some cases, it's nice just to sit back and kind of appreciate the sort of more intimate moments that these remote monitoring methods lets us experience. And so this video, this is kind of a nice way to close. This is day one for a little whooping crane chick that happened a couple of years ago. But Mark, if you're able to start that video, there it goes. Yeah, if you can just watch it looks like a empty nest there, but the chick is there. And so the new generation of whooping crane being born there. So I think this is about where we leave it for our presentation, but no, we really appreciate the opportunity to present tonight. And if there's questions or comments, we welcome that. I know the first period might be starting soon, so if people have to leave, we understand that. But yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you guys so much. That was so enjoyable. Really, really appreciate it. I'm going to respect both of your time. I'm going to ask that if people do have questions, you raise your hand and I will call on you and you can ask Mark and John questions. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute your mic and raise your hand. And yeah, if I'll take a look at the chat as well, if there are any questions in the chat. I see some people have already commented, great presentation, very nice to see the baby crane. Thank you so much, incredible. That was so great. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time to share the work that you do. We do have a question. Just a second. Ken has a question. Ken, if you want to ask your question.
John, Mark, that was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I have two questions. One a technical question and one more of a, well, it'll come across a bit random maybe. Of the 16 cranes that were surviving in the early 40s, do you know what the age ratio or the sex ratio was? Male, female?
Yeah, it was highly biased towards males. So I think there were just a couple, two or three females in that population. So it was a real, potentially a real genetic
Yeah.
bottleneck.
So of the 557 now, they originated from essentially a pair of Eves in a weird sort of way. How did you manage, or how was inbreeding managed so that you wouldn't get any complications from reuse of that genetic pool?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I mean it really comes down to management by the captive breeding centers or by the centers where conservation breeding is carried out in Canada and the United States. And they spend a lot of time thinking very carefully about how to pair cranes up, and
Right.
using knowledge of genetics to make good pairings that will result in better outcomes when the young cranes that result from those pairings are released into the wild.
Cool. Okay, thanks. The second question, completely unrelated, was I saw, Mark, in one of your slides, a photo credit to Roberta Bondar with the current
Yes,
interest
Roberta
in the
Bondar is.
artist. And she was interviewed extensively during that. That was quite a pleasant surprise to see her name there.
Well, she's a very accomplished and talented photographer, as you may know, and she's written a book that contains her bird photography, which links to her work, in space. And as an astronaut and a conservationist, she's put a lot of thought and spent a lot of time into taking photographs that help, get people thinking about the habitats and the environments and the birds themselves. So we've been very fortunate to have been able to work with Dr. Bondar, both at Wood Buffalo and in Saskatchewan over the years.
Yeah, thank you. I see there's another question, so I'll stop talking.
Thanks, Ken. Heidi, what about you?
Hi, my question is probably not as well articulated as Ken's, but I was curious about the migration and the extended period of them being in southern Saskatchewan, and with that trend increasing. Have you guys seen any risks with that, or do you guys predict any risks with them staying in the north longer?
Well, so the extended period of occupancy in Saskatchewan, in central Saskatchewan, is in the fall, and on the front end of that means that cranes are arriving earlier. So they're arriving earlier in central Saskatchewan from Wood Buffalo. And the reasons for that could be many, but we focused mainly on what happens on the back end. So like on their way to Texas, they're spending longer in the province, and we think that's due to due in part to climate change. We see the wetlands being open for longer, cranes being able to spend longer in the province, and therefore take advantage of the resources that are available to them in Saskatchewan. Of course, spending more time in any one place exposes you to more of whatever risks are present in that place. And so that's one reason we've turned our attention to studying what's in the water. So we know from wetland sampling and just from first principles that wetlands accumulate agrochemicals, pesticides, and that those can bioaccumulate. So species consuming food in those areas can be impacted by those contaminants. We don't know yet whether whooping cranes are affected in that way, and that's work that still remains to be done. We need to conduct studies that allow us to sample the tissue of the cranes themselves, so blood and feathers and other tissue that can be collected without causing harm to the birds, to determine if they are in fact accumulating those chemicals. Other risks are power lines. So cranes will fly into power lines and die during migration. And in Western Canada, we have an extensive network of power lines that migratory birds, including whooping cranes and sandhill cranes, sometimes collide with. And so that's also a risk.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you for this presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Bill, what about you? What's your question?
Okay, I may have misheard at the end, but it's about the nesting success rate. You talked about it. We basically back in '66 started with 45 nests. We're up to 115, and then at the very end you talked about 67% in the hatching success, 33 nests out of 49. So that's 49 out of the 115. Is that correct?
Yeah, sorry, that's of the nests that we're monitoring with those trail cameras and other monitoring equipment. So not the entire population had that monitoring equipment. So those percentages only reflect that sample that was monitored. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that clarity.
Does anyone have any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you again, John and Mark, for presenting tonight. We really, really appreciate it. As mentioned, this presentation was recorded and is going to be added to Nature Alberta's Nature Network series on YouTube. So be on the lookout for that. It should be posted in the next few days. So if you do need the link, like if you have trouble finding it on YouTube, feel free to email info@wbwri.org, and I will respond to your message with that link if you're having trouble locating the webinar. But thank you so much for coming, and happy Earth Day. What a great day to have such a presentation. So this was awesome, and thank you so much everyone for coming, and yeah, happy Earth Day.
Thank you so much for the invitation. We're very glad to present to you tonight, and I hope everyone has a good evening.
Thanks again, guys.
Yep.
Really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, everyone.